By the end of 1914, this war was never meant to look like this. Military planners had promised speed, politicians had promised control, and millions of soldiers had been promised a quick return home. Instead, Europe froze. Across hundreds of kilometers, two massive armies stood facing each other, not advancing, not retreating, simply waiting. The rapid movements of the early months had vanished. Offensives failed, flanks collapsed, and every attempt to break through ended the same way, with bodies on the ground. What no one expected was silence, a deadly stillness spreading across the Western Front. The war had not ended, it had stopped moving, and in that moment a new kind of warfare was born, one that would consume men slowly, relentlessly, without mercy. When attacks failed again and again, survival became the priority. Not victory, not glory, just survival. Bullets came from nowhere, artillery fell without warning, and the open battlefield became a death sentence. So soldiers did the only thing that made sense. They went down. They dug into the earth with shovels, bayonets, even bare hands. At first, the trenches were shallow, temporary protection, but as days passed, they grew deeper, longer, stronger. What began as shelter became structure. What was meant to last hours began lasting months. Entire armies disappeared beneath the surface. The battlefield no longer belonged to the land above. It belonged to the soil below. Inside the trenches, war lost any trace of romance. There were no heroic charges here, no speeches, no victories to celebrate. Only mud, water, and waiting. Men lived packed together in narrow corridors carved into the earth. They slept standing up. They ate whatever could be delivered. They breathed damp air thick with rot. Rats moved freely, feeding on the dead. Disease spread quietly from man to man. Fear became constant. Every sound could signal artillery. Every silence felt unbearable. This was not the battlefield soldiers had imagined. It was survival reduced to its most brutal form. Between the trenches lay a place without ownership. No flags marked it, no shelter protected it. They called it no man's land. Once fields and farms, it became a wasteland of mud and wire. Every meter was observed, every movement answered with gunfire. Shells tore the ground apart until nothing remained alive. Bodies lay where they fell, unreachable, unmourned. To step into no man's land was to accept uncertainty, to accept that survival depended on luck alone. It was the most dangerous ground on earth. Despite the reality on the ground, orders kept coming. Commanders still believed in attack. They believed discipline could overcome machine guns. They believed courage could outrun bullets. Whistles blew. Men climbed out of the trenches and moved forward, slowly, openly, directly into fire. Machine guns did not hesitate. Artillery did not miss. Entire units vanished in minutes. The ground absorbed them without memory. To advance was not bravery, it was arithmetic, and the numbers always favored death. Before this war, no army truly understood what a machine gun could do. They were seen as support weapons, defensive tools, something secondary. That illusion ended in the trenches. A single machine gun crew could stop hundreds of men, not slowly, not gradually, in seconds. Attack formations designed for earlier wars collapsed instantly. Lines disappeared. Officers fell first. Momentum died before it could begin. What once required courage and numbers now required something armies did not yet possess, a way to survive modern firepower. The battlefield had changed, the tactics had not, and men paid the price. If machine guns ruled the surface, artillery ruled everything else. Shells fell day and night, without warning, without pause. Men never saw what killed them. They only heard the sound, and then nothing. Entire landscapes were erased. Trees vanished. Villages dissolved into dust. The ground itself became unstable, cratered, flooded, alive with explosions. Artillery did not just kill bodies. It destroyed nerves. It shattered sleep. It broke the mind. This was not combat. It was bombardment without end.
For most soldiers, the war was not constant fighting. It was waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for supplies. Waiting for the next shell. Hours passed in silence. Days blurred together. Men stared at the same stretch of mud, knowing that at any moment everything could end. This waiting was its own kind of torture. It allowed fear to grow unchecked. It gave the mind time to imagine the worst. In the trenches, time did not heal. It only stretched the suffering.
The human mind was never meant to endure this. Endless noise, constant danger, no escape. Some men stopped speaking. Others shook uncontrollably. Many simply broke. They called it shell shock. They did not understand it. They often punished it. But this was not weakness. It was the mind reaching its limit. War was no longer only destroying bodies. It was destroying people from the inside.
By 1915, the truth was impossible to ignore. Millions were dead. Millions more were trapped. Neither side could advance. Neither side could withdraw. Every new attack promised the same result: more bodies, less ground. The war had become a deadlock, a grinding stalemate. And as the months dragged on, one question grew louder than any explosion. How do you end a war that no one can move forward in?
If armies could not move forward, they searched for something new, something decisive. Engineers, scientists, and commanders were given a single task: break the deadlock. Old rules were questioned. New weapons were rushed to the front. Anything that promised advantage was considered. This was no longer just a military struggle. It was an industrial race. Factories replaced strategy. Production replaced imagination. The war was about to change again, not because it had to, but because it could. Science had always supported war. Now it led it. Chemists, engineers, physicists, men who once studied progress were now asked to perfect destruction. Laboratories turned into weapons workshops. Formulas became tools of death. Distance no longer mattered. Accuracy mattered less. Volume mattered most. For the first time, modern science was fully mobilized, not to save lives, but to end them faster. The battlefield was becoming experimental, and the soldiers were the test subjects. The weapons changed faster than the men who used them. New tools arrived at the front with little explanation and no preparation. Soldiers trained for rifles now faced firestorms of steel. Instructions were brief, mistakes were fatal. What once required skill and courage now demanded endurance and luck. The gap between technology and training widened, and the men in the trenches stood in between. Before gas came fear of the unknown. Rumor spread faster than orders. Strange smells, burning eyes, invisible threats. Men whispered about new weapons that could crawl across the battlefield. No one knew when it would arrive or how to stop it. The air itself began to feel dangerous, and soldiers waited, knowing that something worse was coming. By the middle of the war, the battlefield stood on a threshold. Everything old had failed. Everything new was untested. Commanders searched for a breakthrough. Soldiers sensed disaster. What was about to be unleashed would change warfare forever. Not with noise, but with silence. The next chapter of this war would not arrive with explosions. It would arrive on the wind.
When the gas finally came, it did not announce itself with explosions. There was no warning shot, no thunder, only a strange cloud moving slowly across the battlefield. At first, some soldiers thought it was smoke. Others believed it was harmless. They were wrong. The gas crept into trenches, hugging the ground, slipping into lungs and eyes. Men began to cough, then choke, then panic. War had found a new weapon, one that attacked the body from the inside.
The first reaction was confusion. The second was terror. Men clawed at their throats, desperate for air that no longer helped them. Orders vanished in the chaos. Discipline collapsed. Some tried to run. Others froze where they stood. There was no enemy to shoot, no direction to charge. The battlefield dissolved into instinct. Fight, flee, or suffocate. For the first time, nature itself had become the weapon. Survival demanded adaptation. Cloth soaked in urine, improvised masks, desperate measures. Soon, proper gas masks arrived, awkward, heavy, terrifying in their own way. Breathing became mechanical, vision narrowed. The face of the soldier disappeared behind rubber and glass. To survive, men had to become something else, something less human. Gas did not replace bullets or shells. It joined them. The battlefield became layered with threats, seen and unseen. Survival now depended on timing, on equipment, on luck. A soldier could do everything right and still die choking in a trench. The war had crossed a line. From this point on, there were no limits left to test. Perhaps the most disturbing change was not the weapon itself, it was how quickly men adapted. Gas attacks became routine, masks were checked like rifles, fear became procedural. What once caused panic became another line in orders. The extraordinary turned ordinary. And as soldiers adjusted to breathing through rubber, the war continued, just as brutal, just as endless. Fatigue became universal. Not the kind cured by sleep, but a deeper exhaustion that settled into bones and minds. Men grew older in months, faces hardened, eyes dulled. Every movement required effort. Every day felt longer than the last. Even fear grew tired. In the trenches, survival was no longer heroic. It was mechanical, a routine carried out by bodies running on empty. Time lost its meaning. Days blended together. Weeks passed without markers. Men stopped counting, stopped asking how long they had been there. Only rotations mattered, only survival until the next relief. The future shrank to hours, sometimes minutes. In the trenches, time did not move forward, it dissolved. Slowly, something else began to fade. Compassion, shock, reaction. Men stepped over bodies without stopping, not because they were cruel, but because they could no longer afford to feel. Death became familiar. Loss became expected. To continue functioning, soldiers learned to numb themselves. The war did not only destroy lives, it eroded what made life human.
And yet, life continued. Men ate, they joked, they wrote letters home. In between shelling and fear, Normality forced its way through. These moments were fragile, temporary, but they mattered because they reminded soldiers that there was still a world beyond the trench walls, even if it felt impossibly far away.
By now, endurance mattered more than bravery. Not the strength to charge forward, but the strength to remain, to wake up, to wait, to survive another day. The trenches did not reward heroes, they rewarded persistence. And as the war dragged on, those who endured became the backbone of armies, not because they wanted to fight, but because they could still stand. By now, the trenches felt less like defenses and more like cages. The walls closed in, the horizon disappeared. Men spoke of the war as something above them, something happening somewhere else. The trench became the entire world. Everything beyond it felt unreal. There was no sense of advance, no sense of retreat, only containment. The war was no longer surrounding the soldiers, it was enclosing them. Leaving the front did not mean escaping the war. Those sent to the rear carried it with them, in their sleep, in their silence. The trenches followed them everywhere. There was no clean return, no reset. Once a soldier had lived inside the trench system, it became permanent. The war marked men long before it killed them, and for many, there was no way back to who they had been. Eventually, the unimaginable became routine. Mud, gas, shelling, all accepted as part of daily life. Men adapted not because they wanted to, but because they had to. This adaptation was not strength, it was necessity. The war reshaped behavior, emotion, expectation. What once horrified now barely registered. And that may have been the war's greatest victory. By this stage, few spoke of victory. They spoke of survival, of rotations, of time served. The idea of an end felt abstract. The war had no clear direction, only continuation. It consumed resources, bodies, years, without offering resolution. This was not a campaign anymore. It was a condition. The stalemate could not last forever. Something had to break. Not the trenches, but the limits holding the war in place. What followed would be larger, more violent, more industrial. Entire nations would be pushed beyond endurance. The war was about to escalate, not gradually, but catastrophically. The next phase would no longer be about holding ground. It would be about breaking everything else. Close your eyes for 1 second and imagine this. The front line isn't a trench, it's the next room. Not a hill, not a field, a doorway. One thin wall between you and someone listening for your breathing. In Stalingrad, the city stopped behaving like a city. Streets vanished under rubble. Windows became gun ports. Stairwells became traps. And every step asked the same question: empty or ambush? The Germans gave this fighting a name, Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. And once you understand what that word really meant, you'll feel the city closing in. But why did this single city become so unavoidable in the first place? Stalingrad sat on the Volga River, a lifeline for transport and industry. Control the river and you squeeze supplies, fuel, reinforcements. In 1942, the German advance pushed east, chasing resources and a decisive collapse. The city became a symbol both sides refused to surrender. But here's the twist. When you try to take a city like Stalingrad, you don't just fight an army, you fight geometry. Angles, corridors, cover, shadows. And the closer both sides got, the more the land itself began to funnel them. So what happens when an entire front is forced into one burning pinpoint? On a map, everything looks clean, controlled, and intense. But on the ground, distance is an illusion. Roads and rail lines fed men and machines into one place. A funnel doesn't only pull you forward, it traps you in predictable routes. It punishes supply failure. It rewards whoever holds the choke points. Stalingrad wasn't just a battlefield. By geography alone, it was a machine built to consume armies. And before the War of Rats even began, the city had to be broken.
Before the War of Rats, the city had to be turned into something unrecognizable. Bombing and artillery didn't just destroy buildings, they destroyed orientation. A street sign meant nothing if the street wasn't there anymore. And rubble does something terrifying. It creates 1,000 hiding places, 1,000 angles, 1,000 ways to be shot by someone you never saw. This is where the battlefield shrinks, from kilometers to meters, from front lines to corners. And once war becomes a fight for corners, it becomes personal.
Rattenkrieg wasn't a clever term. It was a confession. It meant fighting like you're trapped inside a collapsing maze, where you don't see the enemy at 50 meters, you sense them at 5. In Stalingrad, stairwells mattered more than streets. Basements mattered more than plazas. A single room could be the front line. Here's the nightmare part. Sometimes both sides were inside the same building, not floors apart, sometimes separated by one wall. So ask yourself, how do you fight a war where the map is your memory and the enemy might be breathing on the other side of the plaster?
Urban combat rewrites the rules of what matters. Long range, not always. When the enemy is 10 steps away, what matters is speed and surprise. Submachine guns for corridors, rifles for windows and long sight lines across courtyards, grenades for corners you can't see, and winter gear, heavy coats, padded jackets, scarves, not for comfort, but to keep fingers working. But the most important tool in Stalingrad wasn't metal, it was attention. Because here, danger often arrived as sound before sight, a boot on brick, a breath, a scrape, and then silence.
You didn't advance in Stalingrad. You cleared. A doorway, a corner, a stair landing, then another room. Hallways were kill zones. Open courtyards were death sentences unless covered. Walls weren't barriers, they were options. Sometimes you avoided a hallway by breaking through a wall instead. And every decision was made under pressure in seconds. Do you rush? Do you wait? Do you throw a grenade? Do you fall back? This is why Rattenkrieg is so feared. It turns war into a chain of tiny decisions, and one wrong decision ends everything. Above ground, the ruins were exposed. Below ground, the city had veins. Basements could connect buildings. Sewers could move men unseen. In a world where every street is watched, underground becomes a highway. But underground has its own terror. Darkness steals direction. Echoes lie. Time stretches. You listen for footsteps, then realize it might be your own echo. You follow a tunnel, then realize you're lost under a city that's collapsing above you. In Stalingrad, Even the ground beneath you was part of the battlefield.
In most wars, you fight for ground. In Stalingrad, you fought for structures. A good building controlled approaches like a machine gun's field of view. Defenders turned windows into firing poles. Rooms became layers, cover behind cover behind cover. And strong points mattered because losing one didn't just lose space, it changed the maze. It opened new routes for the enemy. It exposed your flanks inside the city. This is the hidden lesson of Stalingrad. Urban war isn't only about firepower, it's about how ruins reshape movement.
Now add one more factor, the fear of standing up. Snipers didn't only kill, they controlled behavior. They froze courtyards, pinned routes, forced men to crawl. In rubble cities, 1 second in the wrong window can be fatal. So soldiers learned a new habit: move in bursts, hug walls, avoid silhouettes, watch reflections. And that's the psychological side. You stop trusting daylight. You stop trusting stillness, because stillness can be a sniper waiting. In Stalingrad, even safe moments were traps disguised as quiet.
Not everyone in Stalingrad wore a uniform. Civilians hid in cellars, searching for warmth, water, and anything edible. Smoke meant heat, but also attention. A single cooking fire could reveal a shelter. Survival wasn't dramatic. It was carrying buckets through ruins. It was splitting crumbs. It was enduring impact sounds that never truly stopped. And here is the cruel truth. In a city where rooms are contested, even hiding becomes dangerous, because the building you're hiding in might become the next battlefield.
The Volga was more than a river. It was a lifeline and a risk line. Supplies and reinforcements crossed under fire, often at night, using smoke and darkness as cover. If the crossing failed, defenders didn't just lose ammunition, they lost the ability to hold the next building, the next corner, the next hour. And when ice forms, the river doesn't become safe, it becomes exposed. Movement leaves tracks, crossing becomes visible. So the Volga wasn't just geography, it was the beating heart that kept the city alive, and every beat came with danger. While the city consumed men room by room, something larger was forming outside. In November 1942, Soviet forces struck the flanks, not the strongest point, but the vulnerable edges. This is the kind of move that changes everything. The battle stops being only about streets and buildings and becomes about encirclement. And in winter, encirclement turns time into an enemy. Fuel shrinks, food shrinks, ammunition shrinks, and every day inside the pocket becomes colder and more desperate. The maze is still there, but now there's no exit.
Encirclement turns survival into arithmetic. How much fuel, how much food, how many bullets, how much warmth can you steal from a ruined room? Positions chosen for tactics become positions chosen for shelter. Men search for walls that block wind, basements that won't collapse, corners that aren't exposed. And something else happens. Silence becomes heavy, because silence means waiting, and waiting means time running out. This is where Stalingrad stops being a battle and becomes a slow, freezing collapse. Rottenkrieg wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a grinding collapse of plans, buildings, and human limits. It proved modern war could become fear in a hallway, survival in a basement, and decisions made in seconds that decide life or death. Stalingrad didn't only change a map, it changed what armies believed they could endure. And that's why people still talk about it, because the horror wasn't only in the casualties, it was in what the city turned warfare into. That's why the word Rattenkrieg still chills people today, because the most terrifying front line isn't far away, it's the one right next to you. If you want the full Stalingrad story, how it began, how it turned, and what it cost. Keep watching the channel.